On a misty autumn afternoon, as the faint light of the day faded across the rolling hills of the English countryside, Edward Marlowe drove his small car along a bumpy dirt road, his mind adrift to the rhythmic sound of raindrops pattering on the windshield. The silence around him was profound, broken only by the wind whispering through the bare branches and the contemplative breath of nature, seemingly preparing for the quiet of night. Edward, a young man living alone, could feel the cold seeping through every layer of his clothing as the rain intensified. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the slippery road ahead, determined to reach home before darkness fully descended. But then, a faint, weak sound pierced through the steady murmur of the rain. A cry, gentle and soft, it was like a plea for help, barely audible yet enough to make Edward freeze in his tracks, a mix of curiosity and concern stirring within him. Stopping the car, Edward stepped out, his coat quickly soaking through under the biting cold rain. He listened intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the peculiar cry. It echoed again, weaker this time, as if the creature making it was nearing the end of its strength. Following the sound, his mud-splattered shoes squelched against the sodden ground as he cautiously moved forward into the shifting shadows. The wind howled through the shrubs, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and rain, thickening the air with tension. Beneath a rhododendron bush near the edge of a stream, Edward knelt and found the tiny creature. It was curled up into a trembling ball, its fur matted and soaked, caked in mud. Its large, round eyes, brimming with fear, stared at him silently. Edward felt his heart clench. In that moment, all the fatigue and cold seemed to vanish, replaced by an overwhelming urge to protect this fragile being. He crouched lower, careful not to startle it. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe now," he whispered, his voice soft and warm like a gentle reassurance. The little creature didn't move, only gazed back at him with anxious eyes. Slowly, Edward extended his hand, cautious and deliberate, as if any sudden motion might send it fleeing. When his hand touched its wet, icy fur, he could feel the heartbreaking fragility of its small body. This wasn't just a lost puppy, it was a life teetering precariously on the brink between survival and demise. Without hesitation, Edward removed his coat and wrapped it around the tiny creature to provide warmth. "Don't be afraid. I'll take you home," he murmured, almost as if convincing himself as much as the small animal. Holding it close to his chest, he could feel the faint warmth of its fragile life seeping through, chasing away the chill in his own heart. As he made his way back to the car, the rain continued to pour relentlessly, but Edward felt a small flicker of light ignite within him, a fragile, hopeful spark amidst the darkness of the stormy night. Edward's small house stood quietly in the midst of a peaceful village, nestled under the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. The warm, golden light from its small glass windows spilled out, blending with the cozy scent of burning wood from the fireplace, creating a haven of warmth amidst the chilly weather. As Edward crossed the threshold, he felt a calming sense of relief, as if the house itself was welcoming him and the special little guest he had brought home. He gently placed the small creature onto a soft towel he had laid out near the crackling fire, where the glowing flames radiated a comforting heat. The little creature, still trembling, curled itself into a tight ball, its round black eyes glistening with fear and anxiety. Edward carefully dried its drenched fur, his every movement filled with tenderness. As the last droplets of water were absorbed, he finally had the chance to take a closer look at this fragile being. Under the firelight, Edward couldn't help but marvel. The puppy had unusually long ears and fur patterned with strange markings he had never seen before. Dark patches interspersed with lighter fur created a wild and intricate design, as though painted by the hand of nature itself. Yet what puzzled Edward most was the creature's eyes. Eyes that held not only fear, but also a peculiar intelligence, as if it were assessing him. Slowly, Edward sat down by the fire, his gaze never leaving the small creature. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" he murmured, not expecting an answer but unable to stop himself from asking. Almost instinctively, he gave it a name: Shadow. The name suited both its dark fur and the air of mystery surrounding it. Shadow seemed to accept the name, tilting its head slightly when Edward called out, but it remained cautious, as though waiting for something unknown. In the days that followed, Shadow quickly adapted to the house, but its behavior left Edward increasingly perplexed. Shadow didn't bark or play like the other puppies Edward had cared for before. Instead, it would often stand by the window, its gaze fixed intently on the world outside, as if searching for or waiting for something invisible. Each morning, as Edward prepared breakfast and sipped his hot tea, Shadow would sit motionless by the windowsill. Its ears perked, listening to sounds only it could perceive. The more Edward observed, the more he realized there was something truly unusual about Shadow. It seemed to possess an instinctive alertness, a sharpness unlike anything he had seen in other dogs. One day, while tidying up, Edward tried giving Shadow a toy ball he had bought, but instead of showing any interest, Shadow merely glanced at it with a cold, indifferent look before turning back to the window. Occasionally, late at night, Edward would wake to find Shadow standing at the foot of his bed, its eyes glowing in the darkness as it stared intently into a corner of the room. A chilling sense of unease would creep over him, making him wonder, had he brought home a creature that didn't belong in this world? Yet, every time Edward considered the thought of letting Shadow go, an inexplicable sense of guilt and attachment filled his heart. He knew, somehow, that this small creature had become an inseparable part of his life, even though its presence raised more questions than it answered. That night, the flames in the fireplace of the living room began to fade, leaving only faint flickers dancing across the worn wooden walls. Edward sat in his familiar armchair, a book in hand, his gaze lazily drifting over the words as his thoughts wandered to distant musings. Shadow lay curled up at the foot of the chair, silent as a shadow at rest. But the stillness of the evening was soon shattered. A low, guttural growl suddenly broke the quiet, causing Edward to startle. He lowered the book, his eyes darting to Shadow. The small creature was no longer curled up. Instead, it stood upright, its ears pricked in alertness. Shadow growled again, a deep sound resonating from its throat, its glowing eyes fixed intently on a dark corner of the room. Edward felt a cold chill run down his spine. He gripped the armrest of the chair tightly, struggling to rationalize Shadow's behavior, but its piercing gaze seemed to be focused on something invisible that he couldn't perceive. "Shadow, it's okay. It's just the darkness," Edward whispered, his voice trembling as he tried to reassure both Shadow and himself. But Shadow didn't respond to his words. It stood motionless, its eyes locked on the corner, growling intermittently as if issuing a silent warning. Edward's breathing grew heavier. He wanted to get up and investigate, but his legs felt rooted to the ground by an unexplainable, icy fear. The entire night, Edward couldn't sleep. The small figure of Shadow, standing motionless and staring at the corner of the room, became an image that haunted his mind. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that perhaps Shadow had been startled by some noise outside. But a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this creature wasn't an ordinary puppy as he had initially believed. The next morning, unable to endure the unease any longer, Edward decided to take Shadow to the village veterinarian. On the way there, Shadow sat silently in the back seat, its eyes still sharp and alert, its ears swiveling at every faint sound. A sense of strangeness hung in the air, making Edward even more anxious. His mind raced with questions, but only one person could provide answers: Dr. Emma Farnsworth. Arriving at the clinic, Edward stepped in with Shadow cradled in his arms, as if to shield it from the curious gazes of others. Dr. Emma, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, greeted them with a warm smile. But her smile quickly faded as her gaze fell on Shadow. "Where did you find it, Edward?" she asked, her brows furrowing slightly. At that moment, Shadow began to show signs of unease. It leapt from Edward's arms, backing away, its ears standing erect, its eyes scanning the room. A low growl rumbled from its throat again. Emma tried to approach slowly, but Shadow's behavior became even more intense, as if it was reacting to an unseen threat. Edward felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. "It's been like this since last night," he said, his voice laden with worry. "I think something's wrong, but I don't know what to do." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. She retrieved a small flashlight and cautiously moved closer to Shadow. As the light shone into the creature's eyes, Emma noticed something unusual. She turned to Edward, her face growing more serious than he had ever seen. "Edward," she began, her tone grave, "I don't think this is an ordinary dog. We need to talk." Emma looked at Edward, her eyes filled with both worry and a grave seriousness. She placed the flashlight on the table, slowly removed her gloves, and took a deep breath. The atmosphere in the examination room seemed to freeze, with only the soft sound of Shadow's breathing breaking the silence. Shadow was now curled up in a corner, its sharp eyes constantly observing every movement of the humans in the room. "Edward," Emma began, her voice lowering as if to emphasize the importance of her next words. "I've worked with many animals throughout my career, but I've never encountered a case like this before." She paused, looking directly into Edward's eyes. "This creature is not a puppy, it's a hyena cub." Those words hit like a bolt of lightning. Edward felt his entire body freeze. He looked at Shadow, still the small creature he had brought home, but now its image seemed to shift in his mind. "A hyena?" he repeated, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "How is that even possible? How could a hyena end up here, in the middle of England?" Emma nodded, her expression still tense. "I'm not sure either. It could have been smuggled or kept illegally and then abandoned. The signs on its body suggest it's been severely malnourished, which explains why it doesn't look like a typical hyena. But whatever the case, its presence here is highly unusual and dangerous." A wave of confusion and turmoil swept over Edward. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but didn't know where to start. Before he could say another word, Shadow suddenly stood up. Its bright eyes gleamed, and its ears perked as though it had detected something beyond human perception. In an instant, it bolted like a streak of lightning, slipping out of Emma's grasp. "Shadow!" Edward shouted, but it was too late. The door to the examination room had been slightly ajar when another client entered, and Shadow seized the opportunity to escape. Its rapid footsteps echoed on the tiled floor before disappearing into the cold air outside. "We need to catch it immediately," Emma said, her tone now urgent. Without hesitation, Edward rushed out of the clinic, with Emma following close behind. The cold wind lashed against their faces, carrying the damp scent of earth and leaves. Shadow, like a phantom, darted through the quiet village streets, moving so swiftly it left only faint dark blurs in its wake. Edward ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't just worried about Shadow's safety. He was also concerned about the safety of the villagers. A hyena, even a small one, was still a wild animal with unpredictable instincts. The lights from the village houses flickered in Edward's vision, but he didn't stop to explain. One thought consumed him. He had to find Shadow. They chased it to a small village square, where Shadow suddenly stopped, standing under the pale moonlight. The small creature turned to face Edward, its deep eyes seeming to convey something unspoken. Edward slowed his pace, trying not to startle Shadow further. "Shadow, it's okay," he whispered, his voice gentle but pleading. Just as Edward thought he was close enough, a faint noise from the distance startled Shadow. It turned sharply and sprinted into the night before Edward could catch it. He stood there, his breaths ragged, a sense of helplessness gripping his heart like an invisible hand. Behind him, Emma placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with sympathy. "We'll find it, Edward, but I think it's time to involve some experts," she said, her tone soft yet firm. Edward nodded, but a deep sorrow welled up inside him. Shadow wasn't just an exotic creature he had inadvertently rescued. It had become an integral part of his life, even in such a short time. The thought of losing Shadow left him feeling hollow, as if a part of himself was slowly disappearing into the night. After an intense chase, Edward finally found Shadow on the crest of a small hill, where vast fields stretched out under the pale moonlight. The cold wind swept through, carrying the rustling of leaves like whispers from nature, bearing witness to this special moment. Shadow stood there, its small figure vibrant with life, facing the vast night sky like a creature destined for eternal freedom. Edward stopped, his breath heavy from exhaustion, but his eyes never left Shadow. The small creature turned its head, its bright eyes glowing under the moonlight, reflecting a mix of strength and fragility. In that moment, Edward felt more clearly than ever that Shadow was not just a wild animal lost in the wrong place. It was the embodiment of something deeper, something beyond human control, a natural beauty, unbound, but also deeply lonely. "Shadow!" Edward called softly, his voice carried by the wind, like a quiet plea. But Shadow did not step closer. It simply stood there, observing him with eyes filled with secrets that Edward knew he would never unravel. Part of him wanted to run toward it, to hold Shadow, to keep it with him forever. But he also understood that keeping Shadow by his side would be selfish, for this was not where the creature belonged. In those deeply emotional moments, Emma and the team of wildlife specialists arrived. They carried a large cage, carefully lined to ensure Shadow would not be harmed. Edward felt a profound pain as he saw their meticulous preparations, as if each step they took etched deeper into his heart the reality that he would have to part with this creature. Shadow seemed to sense what was happening. It did not resist, nor did it attempt to flee. Instead, it walked slowly toward Edward, its glowing eyes reflecting a final glimmer of trust. Edward knelt down, his trembling hand reaching out to touch Shadow's soft fur. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for coming into my life, even if only for a short time." As Shadow was placed into the cage, Edward could not take his eyes off it. He watched the small creature curl up inside the secure space the specialists had prepared. Shadow looked at him one last time, its eyes filled with a mysterious calm, as if it were saying goodbye. When the specialist's vehicle began to roll away, carrying Shadow farther and farther, Edward stood still, the feeling of loss spreading through him like a tide. He knew this was the best thing for Shadow, that it would be cared for and live in an environment more suited to its nature. But knowing that did little to soothe the emptiness in his heart. The wind continued to blow, the stars still twinkled in the night sky, but to Edward, everything felt quieter, emptier. Returning to his small home, Edward felt Shadow's absence in every corner. The soft towel by the fireplace, the toy Shadow had never touched. All of it seemed to remind him of the brief time Shadow had been with him. Yet a comforting thought gradually formed in his mind. Shadow had returned to where it belonged, and Edward had done everything he could to give the creature the best possible chance. Standing by the window, gazing at the starry sky, Edward whispered once more, "Goodbye, Shadow. I hope you'll live a happy life." In the days after Shadow left, Edward's house seemed to lose its vitality. Every corner, every small detail evoked memories of the little creature that had once been there. The gentle sound of Shadow's footsteps on the wooden floor, the way its gaze fixed on the window. Now, all of it existed only in Edward's memory. As he walked past the towel where Shadow once lay, Edward felt a heavy weight in his heart, as if a part of his own life had been taken away. However, that emptiness was not purely pain. In every moment he thought of Shadow, Edward felt a quiet sense of pride. He hadn't kept the creature for himself, but had given it a chance to live according to its wild instincts. He understood that Shadow was not merely a creature he had rescued. It was a precious lesson about kindness and respect for nature. Edward began devoting more time to exploring the natural world. He read books about animals, participated in conservation programs, and shared his story with like-minded friends. One day, while tidying a drawer, Edward came across the collar he had once intended for Shadow. Holding it in his hands, he felt the cold touch of the metal, as if he were holding a piece of his memories. Every night, as he gazed up at the starry sky, Edward wondered if Shadow was now running freely across the fields of the sanctuary. He imagined the little creature lifting its head, looking at the same sky he was seeing, its eyes shining with the joy of freedom and contentment. That image, even though it existed only in his imagination, brought him comfort and strengthened his belief that he had made the right decision. Shadow had taught him that kindness is not about possession, but about letting go at the right time. Sometimes, helping a creature is also a way to help oneself better understand their own place in the world. Edward didn't just save Shadow. He realized that nature is not something humans can claim, but a part of life that must be respected and protected. Though Shadow was gone, its image and story would forever remain a beautiful and irreplaceable part of Edward's heart. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey with Shadow and Edward. If this story touched your heart or inspired empathy and compassion, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help us reach an important milestone, our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support is not only a tremendous encouragement, but also fuels our mission to continue spreading meaningful stories about kindness and connection. I see you in the next story.